verses 1 through 11. Hear the word of the Lord. Come now, you rich people, weep and wail for the miseries that are coming to you. Your riches have rotted. Your clothes are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver have rusted, and their rust will be evidence against you, and it will eat your flesh like fire. You have laid up treasure for the last days. Listen, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, cry out. And the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. You have lived on the earth in luxury and in pleasure. You have fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the righteous one who does not resist you. Be patient, therefore, beloved, until the coming of the Lord. The farmer waits for the precious crop from the earth, being patient with it until he receives the early and the late rains. You also must be patient. Strengthen your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is near. Beloved, do not grumble against one another, so that you may not be judged. See, the judge is standing at the doors. As an example of suffering and patience, beloved, take on the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. Indeed, we call blessed those who showed endurance. You have heard of the endurance of Job, and you have seen the purpose of the Lord, how the Lord is compassionate and merciful. The word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
Advent is waiting. Don't know about you, but I don't particularly like waiting. Done plenty of waiting throughout my life. Waiting for someone, waiting for something, for some event, waiting for results of one kind or another, waiting for, quote, life to begin, waiting for the next stage of whatever it is I happen to be expecting. I'm a little more in the camp of saying things like, justice delayed is justice denied. I want immediate resolutions. I want to see results to all the big issues, to all the problems that we face as individuals, as societies, as a human population on the world. I want to see results now, not decades from now, not in my lifetime, not in some future generation. I kind of want to see them last week, last month, decades ago. I want to see things resolved. I want to see the reign of God implemented on earth 2,000 years ago. I don't want to sit around waiting for some day in the future when all those things that I have hoped for will finally come about. How do I deal with the reality that my sense of timing and God's sense of timing seemingly don't align perfectly? James addresses patience in awaiting the full realization of God's reign upon the earth. He does that against a backdrop of economic oppression, akin to what we would call wage theft today. He speaks of economic injustice as having its own voice that cries out from the very fields that have been mown by laborers whose pay was never paid, at least not in full, or not on time. not in a way that benefited them and met their needs as important and primary. We see James speaking of economic injustice from the perspective of putting things to rights, from taking the side of the afflicted, of the oppressed, the marginalized, for coming to their aid and making them whole. It is in regard to them that he then turns to speak of patience. Patience in waiting for God's arrival, for God's action to put things to rights. He uses the image of the farmer waiting the rains that we hear falling outside. Rains in spring, rains in late summer, knowing there is nothing he can do to usher them in, and waiting on them to come at the proper time. Serving as pastor in rural Virginia, I heard a lot about farmers not paying the preacher, and therefore it wasn't raining, or not paying them in full. I heard the two things tied together as a matter of course. Well, if you don't pay the preacher, then God's not going to send the rain. You need to get up to church and pay your tithe. I don't know how much of this was tied to an understanding of today's passage. The concepts are definitely related, however. James charges the wealthy with accumulating wealth while withholding benefits to the poor, who actually create the wealth for them. He links them to withholding of wages, to God eventually arriving on the scene in judgment and condemnation. Meanwhile, James calls on believers to await patiently. Wait on God's action, just as the farmers wait upon the rain to come at God's direction. They were to wait. They were to be patient. They were not to insist on taking action to change the situation for their own personal benefit. They were not charged with insurrection against the unjust. They were to await God. We discussed something of this in Bible study last Sunday. That it's not our responsibility so much to stand up for our own selves, our own benefits. But yet we are charged to stand up on behalf of others. The farmer in James' portrait simply awaits. He exercises patience. For years, I understood this as sitting on my hands, waiting for God to do something. If I'm going to wait patiently, I'm going to just sit there, do nothing. And then I spent a summer working with my granddaddy on his garden. Just for the family, 4 acres of land, 4 rows of tomatoes, 75 yards long. Nothing to do. Just waiting for the rains to come in the proper time, right? But then I would be out in the field with him at 6 o'clock in the morning, and we'd put in 2 hard hours before breakfast at 8. Hoeing, picking tomatoes, getting rid of weeds, fertilizing, taking care of bugs, all sorts of things to keep us plenty busy. We would pick whatever we were picking for the day. We would come back for breakfast. We might go out again. Granddaddy definitely went out again. I went and played in the woods. It's too hot in Mississippi to be out in the garden after 8 a.m. He was waiting on rains, yes. But there was a whole lot to do in the meantime. whole lot of work on his side, his responsibility to be working with the soil, with the plants, of doing what was necessary, staking tomato plants and picking peas and shelling peas. And boy, did we shell peas. Come into my Mama's trailer and you were handed a dishpan of whatever it happened to be we were working on that day. Waiting for the rains. But very busy with the job in front of us as we awaited what we could not do. Waiting for those things upon which we had to depend upon God. We didn't sit on our hands. We did exercise patient trust for God to come through at the proper time, to do what we could not. If it had been up to me, I would have scheduled the rains. I would have scheduled them to come during the middle part of the day when it was too hot to be out in the garden anyway. I didn't want to be out there after lunch with Granddaddy. It was too hot. That'd be a good time for it to rain. Or maybe during the nighttime, when it wasn't going to interfere with anything or anybody. I definitely would have programmed it not to interfere with our fishing trips. If I were in charge, things might look a little different, but I'm not in charge. There are things beyond my control. And that's where this patient waiting comes in. It's not doing nothing. Waiting patiently for rains looked like Granddaddy continually out in the garden. Morning, afternoon, evening. It looked like him spending some time when he couldn't be out in the garden sharpening his hoe until you could shave with it. That seemed like complete overkill to me. Why does a hoe have to be able to shave hair off my arm? But he understood that that was part of the process of making his work easier. And it was worth that investment, looking toward future labor. That's a better picture of what James had in mind when he talks about awaiting the full arrival of God and God's reign. Now, sitting around in prayer circles, singing praise choruses, or even reading the Bible together were not front and center in what James was talking about. His expectations for the church were much more like those disparate efforts put into preparing the ground and the plants for the coming harvest. It's carrying out the work of loving our neighbors, of giving evidence of the presence of Christ in our lives, of being the fields prepared for growing crops for God's reign. God's reign right here, in our midst, today. It's living as though God is already present with us because God is. Even as we proclaim the reality of God's presence with us at every moment, and yet expect something more still to come. The wealthy, under James' condemnation at the beginning of today's chapter, were busy working to amass their wealth and provide for their future. They weren't particularly lazy. The problem was that their focus was on self, not the well-being of all. They were focused on amassing wealth for their own use, as though that would meet their needs in the age to come. Such a focus was misguided as well as working against their own Rather than preparing them to receive the blessings that lay ahead of them, they were working contrary to what would actually be to their benefit. Their focus was on the short term, while the focus of the farmer was guided by a longer view, looking toward that which was beyond his control, his reach. James does not paint some idyllic picture of followers of Jesus that ignores the reality of our lived experience, the realities of injustice, the realities of oppression, the realities of challenge, difficulty, pain. He doesn't promise that being faithful to Jesus or to the way of Jesus will somehow insulate us from suffering, from difficulty, disease, violence, or danger, fraud, theft, or unexpected even persecution. Rather, he expects our lives on earth to reflect the same kinds of sufferings experienced by Jesus and the prophets. He says those are our examples, including Job, who lost everything and was left only with questions that were unanswerable to him. He expects difficulties, challenges, and injustices to find us where we live. His perspective, however, extends to the other side of those unwanted experiences. And it's also in that beyond that he expects those who luxuriate at the expense of others to find their own reversal, as in the words of Mary's Magnificat that we look to in this season. So in the interim, what are we doing toward making the fullness of God's reign visible in our midst? That's the question that should concern us. James starts off discussing how suffering leads to building character, how it leads to growth and maturity. He discusses how we are to be meeting the needs of widows, orphans, the marginalized. He addressed welcoming one and all as persons of equal worth before God. He addressed applying faith to our daily living, controlling our tongues, seeking after God's wisdom, not living for personal pleasure. Those are the practical steps that he points to in learning or leaning into God's active reign in our lives. Maybe waiting around in Advent is not really as empty a reality as I would tend to interpret it as being. It's not about being inactive. It's not about sitting on my hands. It's not about sitting or standing on a hillside outside of town in anticipation of Christ's return. Rather, it is living into the fullness of God's reign, anticipating what is yet to come, putting in the work of that reign which I cannot yet see. Between now and the coming of the latter rains, there is yet much to do. Can we trust God for the results while we live in faithfulness, faithful expectation, trusting that God will bring about what is still beyond